Hello and welcome, everyone. Hello. It's The Insurgents, episode 94.
94?
94, if you can believe that.
It's a lot of yap.
It is a lot of yapping. Some would say too much. Some of our listeners would probably say that's enough now.
Still enough,
that's
yeah.
Too much.
These guys are still yapping? That's what they would say.
They really are, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well, welcome, everyone. We're happy to be back. We got Rob and Jordan here. How are you doing, Jordan? How's it going?
Rob, I'm doing well. I'm alive.
That's all I can really ask for.
Going into year 3, still, knock on wood, still have not caught COVID, so
yeah,
I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I don't believe I have. I'm pretty sure
I feel like
I
you
haven't.
would know.
I think so. Well, that's the kind of weird thing about COVID, right? Is that some people just get it and it doesn't really affect them that much. So I guess I know I was exposed to it for sure, or it's probably about a year ago.
Mm-hmm. Oh, didn't your kid got it, right?
Yeah, exactly. He was exposed to it at school, and
yeah.
And he was here. So who knows?
Yeah.
Overall, it's funny though. Overall, I feel like I've been healthier for the last couple of years than I usually am. Probably because everyone's wearing masks in public places and the grocery store and stuff. In terms of colds and flus and this normal stuff that you get at this time of year, I've been mostly okay.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think same thing. No real colds or anything. Yeah. I don't know, but we've got 4 tests now from the U.S. government here, so I'm gonna make those last the next 7 years that we're going to be dealing with this. So I think I'm in good shape. Yep.
Well, you won't even need them anymore because it seems like we're just dropping all the restrictions, just slowly getting dropped. It seems like this idea of we're just gonna have to live with the pandemic is becoming kind of part of the sort of Western response to this thing.
Mm-hmm.
We've got all kinds of places just dropping. Yeah, they're bored. They want to move on. They're over it. Yeah.
There was a quote, Sean Maloney, who's House Dem from, I think, Florida, and he is the head of the DCCC, and he also kind of leads on the re-election messaging, and yeah, that's the Democrats' focus because they don't have anything else to run on. They can't really run on Build Back Better, even though it's the big campaign.
They called that's what it's called. Yeah.
Yeah, they can't do that. They can't do raising the minimum wage. They're going to, whatever executive orders they've accomplished, they could, point to those, but those aren't really huge. Infrastructure is a bipartisan thing, so Republicans are going to run on it too. And you're left with nothing. They couldn't even do voting rights.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's you're left with nothing.
Either. Yeah.
And
cool.
They're going to have to try to run on COVID. But in the immediate aftermath of November, December, January being really brutal because of Omicron, that skewed the data, and now Biden has more deaths on his hands than Trump does. And that's because people didn't get vaccinated, and that's because Republicans have demonized the vaccines since the start. But this is the reality. That's what they have to deal with, right? So they can't say everything's better objectively right now because it's not. They have to say, well, we're opening up the country. We guided us back to normalcy. And this is his thing. Yeah. And it's we're going to return to normalcy. And his quote, which I was dying over, I guess it's maybe a little redundant soon, but he was people are sick to death of this pandemic. It's you don't say.
He's always got a way with words. That
incredible choice of words.
Yeah. Well done, sir. Yeah, and I remember the campaign too. We're going to shut down the virus, Jack. That was his whole, how are we going to do that? Well, it's not totally clear. There's a lot of listen to the scientists we were going to do. He even mentioned that they would do further lockdowns if they had to, if that's what scientists advise. But it turns out if you just listen to scientists that say that lockdowns are bad, you can kind of finish that. You can follow through with that campaign promise while doing nothing. So that's politics. That's doing politics.
Yeah, this rush to reopen thing, it's just it's really weird. It's really, really weird. But also here's the thing. What can't you do right now? I'm asking you specifically. Maybe you might not be able to use your roads because of the trucks. But realistically, what can't you do? The only restriction is you have to wear a mask sometimes, and some places require you to show proof of vaccination. But other than that, what can't you do?
Well, this is a good question because, as you mentioned, we got a new government. Got a new government in Canada right now. Or the country's fallen. We've got a trucker junta that is taking place. And it's pretty remarkable. This is a movement that is ostensibly against these kind of mandates. It says what we're being told from certain the people like in the movement and certain extremely online leftists that want to lecture us about this. Jordan, first of all, we got Americans lecturing Canada about what's going on politically. Americans got to mind their own business.
Oh, you're no stranger to that argument.
You don't even live here. Jesus. No, but we do. There are these American Twitch streamers who have weighed in on this and are telling us, "Oh, you've got to support this. You got to support this workers movement, this workers uprising that's happened," which is basically a astroturfed movement of small business owners who are they're protesting these mandates, these vaccine mandates, ostensibly. But really what they want is just basically for everything to even the minor, modest public health measures that have been put in place, that has been too much for them. And they want even that to be removed. And then, as you pointed out, for a lot of these folks, by the way, who took COVID relief money, and these are small business owners that have been getting funding from the government during this crisis. Also, another important thing to point out when you talk about this movement. But as you point out, there haven't even been these draconian restrictions like people are talking about. We've never pursued this zero COVID policy. There's been there's a mild lockdown. There was, like you said, these basic measures in terms of wearing masks in public places or getting a vaccine, showing proof of vaccination. And it's just amazing how even that, despite the fact that all this stuff continuously has remained open, all the Applebee's and the Walmarts and all these chain stores have remained open this entire time. But people are just the basic concept of having any public health measures whatsoever to deal with this pandemic in which, thousands of people are dying or upwards of 1 million people in the United States has just been too much for these folks. And that's the depressing thing. The grim thing is that they seem to be winning this argument. And most elected officials seem to kind of agree with this basic stance. It's not good.
Aren't there restrictions for the lockdown specifically? Isn't that province by province?
Yes. I think they think that it's this measure that's put in place by Justin Trudeau himself.
Yeah, it's Doug Ford is doing it, right?
Yeah, exactly. It goes on it's on a province by province basis. And it happens sometimes with these workplaces that are contributing to these mandates. But I know it's all part of this sort of conspiracy theory about the globalists that are using this to sort of seize power, and Justin Trudeau basically to institute global communism is basically the real story behind the headlines that the fake news media is not covering, and these fine folks are trying to inform us of.
The funniest thing that I've seen, the online fights about this topic devolving into is what constitutes working class by a ton of people who just have never been part of the working class. And one of them was someone was why do we care? They're just in their trucks all day. And I just kind of got a kick out of that because they were it was just some person who had really no familiarity with kind of blue collar labor. It's I mean, they're not for most of their day, sure, but these people go from business to business. If they're a regional driver, they might make multiple stops in a haul. They're stopping at gas stations, convenience stores, and restaurants. And when you what do they think the process is for making a delivery? You have to interact with people in the warehouse. You have to interact with people who work in receiving and the floor manager and all these different types of roles. You're still having face-to-face contact with a bunch of people who often work in poorly ventilated closed spaces in these warehouses. So I mean, I worked in a receiving department in a warehouse before. It was not fun, but look, when delivery guys came, that's sometimes just your only interaction with outside people for the day, so you kind of chat them up. It's just, they do interact with people, so I do see a justification for wanting people like that who are all over the place to be vaccinated, to wear a mask. That's just simple things. This idea that they're the working class defenders who think this is just totally unnecessary is an argument that doesn't really kind of stick with me.
Yeah, and the reality is when it comes to like the trucking industry in Canada, 90% of truckers in Canada are vaccinated. Like all the main trucking unions and advocacy groups are against this convoy. Like they want their drivers to be vaccinated for their own protection. We all know by this point, by the way, that then we should reiterate this. We all know that the vaccine is not some be all and end all solution to COVID. It doesn't stop people from getting COVID or spreading it, but it can prevent people from getting seriously ill, which is I think a good enough reason that people should do it in the first place. The vast majority of actual truckers in this country are vaccinated and are not part of this movement. The huge majority of people that are in this convoy are like driving, Ford F-150 trucks and SUVs from like the suburbs again, or like owning, landscaping businesses or things like this that are just kind of like latching onto this movement and kind of cosplaying as working class. Regardless, though, but it's like you pointed out, there is this kind of discrepancy between who counts as working class and who doesn't. I don't doubt that there are working class people involved in this movement that are against these kind of public health measures. You know who else is working class, though? Nurses. Medical workers, people that work in restaurants, people that work at grocery stores. These people are also all working class as well. And a lot of these folks, as part of this convoy, are constantly screaming at and harassing these people for like asking them to follow these basic measures. Recently in Toronto, this like protest was going on, and they had to literally tell nurses and healthcare workers not to wear their uniforms so they don't get harassed by these people. So there's this insistence that we have to listen to working class people when they speak, but again, there's this complete lack of ability for people to actually like separate who's working class and who isn't. And with this specific group of sort of reactionary, predominantly white people expressing this kind of very, very like typical sort of white grievance politics is what it boils down to. Very, very similar to what the Tea Party was doing 10, 12 years ago in the United States. These people count as working class. We have to listen to them, and we have to always take their concerns seriously, and we have to always not alienate them. But yeah, again, when you talk about, the Black Lives Matter protest, predominantly working class people, Indigenous people, predominantly working class, healthcare workers and other frontline workers in this pandemic, working class. And apparently they're the ones that just shut up and listen to these like extreme reactionaries as they scream at them for trying to do their jobs. It's really, really backwards. And it's very, very annoying to have these kind of like ultra leftists online start lecturing us about how being opposed to this obviously astroturfed right-wing movement is somehow like you're a fake leftist or whatever if you have anything to say about this. Really, really frustrating. And again, Americans, if you don't live here, you don't even go here. Stay out of it. We don't want to hear it.
I first learned of
these people.
I first learned of it when I saw one of the most prominent Magic the Gathering card artists had showed up, and I saw it like in a Magic the Gathering like category on Twitter, and all these people were mad. And
of course, that's how you find out about it.
Yeah, I mean it's important. And his name is Seb McKinnon, and he went and he was like, "I'm proud to stand with Canadians fighting for freedom." And so then I asked my friends who live in Ontario, like, "What's going on here?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, this is like being pushed by a lot of like white nationalist groups." It's like, fuck, sick. All right, cool.
Yeah.
Like same shit that's happening here, and a lot of these people kind of fall into this trap that like under this like freedom and liberty guise, and the guy doubled down when people were like, "Why are you there? This is who's linked to it." He posted a video on his Instagram, BIPOC voices at the Freedom Convoy, and it's like, come on, man.
Yeah.
Come on, you got it. I'm not buying it. Like, just give me a break.
Yeah. The whole thing has just been a really grim spectacle. It doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. Again, and not talking about in other ways that this is like, oh yeah, this spontaneous working class movement. They raised $10 million on GoFundMe, which was then like, because it was disputed and GoFundMe didn't want to be involved with it, they ended up returning these donations. And now, in addition to that, on a new platform, they've raised another $8 million. You see these huge donations coming in. You see like American wealthy business interests in America bragging about being involved in this and helping to fund it. Very, very clearly AstroTurf movement that is literally like doing the job of capital, that is literally on the same side as these wealthy business interests. So, not some authentic working class uprising is the way people are kind of framing it as. And again, even if someone is working class and they're part of this movement, just because there's plenty of extreme reactionaries that are working class, it doesn't mean you need to listen to every single delusional rant that they start talking about. You know, and it's amazing seeing it all over Fox News now, and how conservative media and these conservative influencers like Benny Johnson have kind of latched onto this as well. Talking about the fascist dictatorship of Justin Trudeau in Canada. And that's the thing. It's like, if you actually dig into that, I actually agree that Canada is very fascist, but for none of the reasons that these guys are saying. And a lot of these people in this freedom convoy want the country literally to be more of a fascist ethno-state than it is currently, which is unfortunately not something that I support.
Oh, well, that sucks. I hope this, part of what they're doing, so they're parking their trucks, like, and just blocking traffic. Oh, that too. But like, are they blocking the ability of like ambulances or firefighters to, you know, maneuver throughout the city? Is that a factor?
There's been cases of that, and they're blocking border crossings as well. And there's literally vaccinated truck drivers that are just trying to do their jobs that are not able to right now because these border crossings are being blocked. It's also being treated completely with kid gloves by the police. You've seen a little bit of police action as they go in and bust up these highly organized encampments that have formed, extremely well stocked with all kinds of supplies. And you have the police who predominantly, if you dig into it, most likely support this convoy within huge majorities. These reactionary cops in this country that I have no doubt have made total common cause of these people, completely treating this with kid gloves. And now in the moment where
the shit out of like indigenous protesters.
Exactly. Like I've been looking at this on my stream lately. You see what the cops, how they respond when there's like 20 indigenous people blockading a railway crossing, like with family members and kids there. They send in these heavily armed thugs with assault rifles to arrest and harass these people. And now, like, after 2 weeks of this occupation going on, there's finally some police activity starting to actually, there's actually some consequences starting to happen for the folks that are part of this movement. And it's like they're just going on and on. Like, this is literally 1984 now. This is literally this dystopian fascist government. And again, like all the previous incidents of the police, busting up indigenous protests, climate protests, racial justice protests, these people unequivocally support that. But now that there's actually some consequences for this 2-week long occupation, they're like crying about how oppressed and persecuted they are. And that's all this has ever been about. It's about these people that they're cosplaying as being these working class, salt of the earth types who are being persecuted, despite being the people that are like at the sort of upper part of the hierarchy, the social hierarchy in this country. But just the fact that they've had to have any efforts to follow these public health measures, they've had any kind of inconveniences throughout this process, is way too much for them. That's what they're freaking out about.
It's finally starting to like trickle into U.S. press more, and that's obviously where you're seeing the conversations. But like, I remember when you first brought this up like a week or two ago, I would kind of like shied away from it just because I hadn't seen like anybody here talking about it. But now like Psaki is getting asked about it at press conferences, so it is now like a U.S. story because of the border crossings. They're impacting Canada and U.S. trade. Now you're going to see
they're planning a DC convoy in March, so you're going to be doing your own honkening.
But here's the thing: like, what are they going to do? Like, all they're going to do is like inconvenience lobbyists. Like in that case, like okay, but also, we've got a metro system here. Like, it's gonna impact like people taking Ubers to go to like bars and shit. But like, what are they gonna do here? Also, you'll probably see a more aggressive response from MPD here because this is a city that's no stranger to protests, and they don't really care. I like, unless you have a permit, which they're not going to give you an indefinite permit to just block the roads. You can block one lane if you want without a permit. If you do a protest and you want to march, you can, as long as everyone's moving, you can block one lane. If they block all of traffic, MPD is going to shut it down, I would imagine, pretty quickly. There's just so many different security concerns here, but also, like, they're not going to really inconvenience anybody. Like, there's no truckers or, like a ton of people going through, like, downtown DC. It's going to be just for optics, which is ultimately their play here. Yeah.
Well, we'll see how it goes.
I'm going.
It's pretty annoying. Yeah. if anything, it'll probably be very annoying and loud. It's been a lot of honking. I really do feel for the people that live in like downtown Ottawa. There's people that live and work in this region, and it's just been like nonstop honking for like now 2 weeks. Like, people are not sleeping. People are losing their minds. It's like, it's really, they're like really terrorizing this community that lives there, who again, often
people have no
also
influence over
people.
those decisions.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, enough ranting about that. I've talked about the stupid convoy enough. If this was depressing for anyone too, luckily our conversation that we're having in a couple minutes with Akela Lacy from The Intercept was very lighthearted when we talk about, criminal justice and the mass incarceration and the Amir Locke killings in the United States. Very, very fun, lighthearted conversation. So if anyone's depressed by this intro, then get ready to laugh, because there's some really, really fun stuff coming.
As always, your constant source of humor.
Yeah, that's what people come to this show for. No, it was quite depressing as usual. I'm going to be upfront with that, but really great conversation with Akela. She does a really great job covering all these issues. There's a lot of headlines right now in the U.S. About what's happening in the prison system, about what's happening with the police. So no shortage of things to get into with Akela. Before she comes on, just remind everyone, subscribe to the show. You can subscribe on Substack. It's $5. Get access to the bonus episodes. Our last episode was with Ryan Grimm, also of The Intercept, where we talked about the whole Rogan controversy. We tried to have a little bit of a nuanced discussion about that. Fortunately, nothing happened in the previous week since it came out that made that more complicated and weird, thankfully, because that would make me feel pretty silly. But also a very good discussion. To subscribe to the show on Substack in order to get access to that and other bonus episodes. That's all. I think that's all. I think we covered everything, right?
Yeah, I think so. Let's do it.
All right. So we're going to bring on Akela Lacy of The Intercept. She's going to be joining the show right after this.
And now we're joined by Akela Lacy of The Intercept. You've been on with us before. I believe we've asked the gamer question, and I can't remember your answer. So refresh our memory. Do it again. Yeah. Are you a gamer?
Actually, I'm kind of embarrassed, but in the 5 minutes that I had between my last call and this, I was playing Mario Kart.
Nice.
So yeah.
So you're a committed gamer.
Yeah. This is like a serious thing.
It's like a relaxation thing, which Mario Kart is honestly not really relaxing, which maybe says a little bit more about me than I should be willing to say.
You get hit with one of those blue shells right before you get to the finish line that sends all the stress levels and the blood pressure just spiking immediately.
Yeah, it's caused a couple of arguments between me and my boyfriend, honestly, over the last couple months. So it gets a little tense, but
I can get heated.
It's also it's just therapeutic,
Who do you use? Who's your go-to?
Yoshi.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm always more of a Toad person.
Toad is the most.
I'm Toad. That's my Mario Kart go-to.
He's fast. He's a zippy little guy.
He's also the most annoying character to get beaten by because he just looks annoying. It's like if you're beat by Waluigi or Donkey Kong, I'm like, okay, I can take that. It's fine. But Toad is just like a slap in the face.
He's a little rat.
Yeah, he's a rat.
So, Akela, we're grateful you're here. You've been on before, and we're kind of just going through the Intercept roster in the past couple episodes, I guess. I mean, it'd be nice to have Ken on, but I don't think, just based on kind of internal politics, HR protocols, the band's still in place, we can't really have him on again. So it's good that we had Ryan on last week. We've got you on this week. We love most of the Intercept staff, so... it's good to have you here. Yeah,
thanks for having me. I too hope that Ken can one day join. But
well, he knows what he did.
Yeah, we don't need to relitigate that ugliness.
You have been one of the best in covering criminal justice, police brutality, and racial justice in areas like Philadelphia and throughout the country. And, we've had you on before to talk about some of these things. And sadly, a few stories and a few incidents throughout the country over the past couple of weeks basically, have forced this conversation again. And we felt who better than you to come on and talk about it. And, we just saw the killing of Amir Locke in Minneapolis. We were seeing prisons wrestling with COVID. We're seeing the impacts of prison populations being subject and influencing gerrymandering. And these are all things that you've been covering. So we're grateful you're here. How have you been holding up?
Well, year 3 of the pandemic, I think everyone is a little bit brain dead at this point, but all things considered, I'm doing well. I have a job, I have a home. So yeah, things are good, but, there are, a lot of bad things are happening. I feel like we were sort of thrown from covering, months and months of like gridlock over Build Back Better, Manchinima, yada, yada, yada. And now we're back into what feels like sort of what was the start of the summer of 2020. There, this horrible raid happened that killed Amir Locke in Minneapolis. And there was just reporting I saw actually today from the Washington Post that fatal police encounters spiked in 2021 for the first time since they've been tracking it, which, after sort of, at the same time, I can't count how many articles I have seen in the past just 3 days about, how bad it is that, for example, in Axios today, I saw an article about how, Cori Bush is not going to back down from the defund the police slogan, even though her Democratic colleagues want her to. And for people who live in a more sane world, I think it's pretty obvious how, disgustingly hypocritical that kind of framing is when we are seeing these statistics and we're just coming off of a raid in an apartment that was, that killed someone who wasn't named on the warrant, in a city that was supposed to be dismantling and radically changing its police department. And, coverage about how terrible defunding has supposedly been, when in reality, no major police department significantly cut their budgets. And after 2020, actually, any cuts that they had were totally wiped out because of successful efforts to use this rhetoric to increase and continue inflating their budgets.
Well, I really think it's worth taking a step back and it's because it's really incredible, this kind of 2-year process that's taken place where you have this horrific murder in Minnesota of George Floyd, which kicks off literally the largest mass protest movement in modern American history, against this kind of police violence, against this kind of systemic racism in policing. It was this nightly example of police violence. It was a protest against police violence, and we Jordan cataloged a lot of this stuff. Every single night, these peaceful protests being escalated into riots by these heavily militarized police officers going in, assaulting people. It was just rampant police violence night after night. And this goes on for months and months and months. Eventually, you have the Democratic Party, kind of trying to absorb some of that energy into sort of an electoral movement to elect Democrats, and participating in these very surface level, completely arbitrary sort of gestures, like dressing in kente cloth and kneeling and doing these really embarrassing kind of spectacles, while not actually campaigning on or changing anything about the way policing works in the United States, while simultaneously being accused by their opponents of being these kind of radical abolitionists or something. And then, in fact, when they're disappointed in their electoral results, the first thing that they do is blame the very activists who they've been kind of trying to gesture towards for being, like you mentioned, too outrageous and too radical with their calls to defund the police, and suggesting that this call is the thing that's really the thing that's hurting them electorally, and kind of telling people like Cori Bush, telling activists to kind of quiet down with that kind of talk. And then, so 2 years after this process in Minnesota, again, one of the epicenter of this movement, where you have, the mayor is Jacob Frey is his name, I believe, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Who kind of was a big character around these protests. He's the mayor of Minneapolis. Got reelected on the promise of ending no-knock warrants. That's kind of his big kind of reformist pitch to voters to reelect him, right? We're going to end no-knock warrants. And now, so you have a no-knock warrant, which results in this really horrific killing, again, of Amir Locke, which you mentioned earlier. one of the worst such incidents that we've seen. We've seen the body cam footage of it. It's absolutely horrendous, being killed like literally while sleeping on his sofa during this no-knock warrant, which is for a warrant that he's not even named in. And it just shows, like, despite this mass mobilization, despite the biggest mass mobilization in modern American history, it really drives the point home how nothing has really fundamentally changed about the way policing works in the United States. And in fact, like we've pointed out a couple of times, police departments have not only not been defunded, but have been given more money predominantly. Like, it's the main thing Joe Biden campaigned on. And it's like, I don't know what that means for activists, activists that have really put their bodies and lives on the line trying to have these conversations. It's got to be very, very discouraging for everyone in these communities to still be dealing with this exact same problem after all this time and after all that effort and energy.
Yeah. I mean, the other sort of, I think this sort of puts a fine point on everything that you're saying is the judge who presided over Derek Chauvin's trial signed off on the warrant in this case. And like that is just sort of one example of the fact that no individual, like, yeah, sure, Derek Chauvin was convicted of murder in George Floyd's case, but no other actors in the system that made it possible for him to do what he did and to, go through the police force getting all these other complaints throughout his history and not being removed or like, substantively disciplined. No people who made that possible were held accountable. And that's sort of what is that's one of the most frustrating things about this, because the calls from activists, the calls that we saw coming out of the 2020 protests were for things that would address that issue, would address the systems that make it possible for these things to keep happening over and over with no sense of accountability or change. And they were called too aggressive and too, they're asking for too much. They don't know what's good for them. Unfortunately, this is the same messaging that, that Republicans and white supremacists were using to counter the civil rights movement. And so I think, yes, it's frustrating. It's, it's really disturbing in a lot of ways, but a lot of people who are in the activist community, or who are in communities that are most significantly impacted by mass incarceration and police brutality, know that this is how it goes. And so I don't necessarily think, I'm not going to speculate one way or the other, but I don't think that it bodes necessarily poorly for how much energy the community in this situation will have, the activist community will have. But I do think it raises a lot of questions about what is actually possible within the systems that we're operating in. Another thing I wanted to mention, that I think illustrates this really well. In a meeting on Monday, this is in the reporting that I did on the Amir Locke case this week, but in a meeting on Monday with the city council officials about Minneapolis's use of no-knock warrants, Jacob Frey was talking about, this is the Minneapolis mayor, Jacob Frey, was talking about this policy, Rob, that you mentioned, that he had allegedly, severely restricted the use of no-knock warrants in Minneapolis to the point that they were basically not using them anymore. And reporting showing that that wasn't the case at all, that they had actually, after that policy change went into effect, I think in the 9 months after it went into effect in 2020, they had asked for 90 no-knock warrants, which was, pretty much in line with what they had been requesting prior to the policy change. So you have city council members point blank asking the mayor, what's up? Like, why did you say this was a ban when it clearly wasn't a ban? What is the difference between the policy change that you purportedly put in place in 2020 and what you're going to do now, when he's saying that he's going to put a moratorium on no-knock warrants? And his answer is, you know what, like, you're right. Even an outright ban isn't really an outright ban, because there are situations where police can go into your home without permission from a chief or a judge if they determine that, there's an imminent threat. And they have unbelievable leeway in making that determination. And so you have the mayor of this city that is the epicenter of this nationwide, this global movement for criminal justice reform and addressing police brutality, basically admitting that his central, his central commitment to this movement and what, helped him get reelected and what was then used as a model in other cities that actually have gone further than him, but that's a different point, that he can't actually do it, like that he has no power to do it. And whether or not that's, that's true or false, that's not the point. It's that this is the state that elected officials are in. And I think at the national level, you have people who are just cowering from even taking a stance on this because of how effective the messaging from the right has been on, what this movement has purportedly done to spark this crime wave, and sort of what's going to happen to you if you express support for criminal justice reform. So that, I think, is what's more concerning, and sort of how we're gonna see that evolve over the next election cycle, particularly.
That's the thing. Like, they haven't done anything on this front, specifically on defunding the police, and we saw that play out this week. People are saying, "Oh, Cori Bush needs to stop using that term," and thankfully she's not. And the blame that Rob alluded to was tossed around, especially in House races, in I think a Dem caucus call in the wake of the election, specifically with Dem leadership trying to blame that as a cause for the loss in some of the Florida races. And Debbie Muckersole Powell, who lost, I think it was the 26th district in Florida, they tried to say that her district was impacted by that rhetoric, and she even spoke out and was like, that isn't what's happening. That was not why we lost. So it's even the people who are there and know their district and are the ones losing are denying it. It's ultimately just the people who are leading this, trying to dictate the messaging because they want to, they don't want to alienate the private prison industry, the bail industry, the cash bail industry. I mean, this is something specifically that Kamala championed when she was in the Senate. She wanted to end cash bail, and we haven't really heard much about that since. So these are things that people will use when it's convenient, and they'll throw progressives and leftists under the bus when when it's time for them to take responsibility for losing elections. But nothing's really been done. And in fact, last week, Biden called for more funding for the police. So this idea that the rhetoric is hurting them in any way is just totally ludicrous, because nothing's happening. Absolutely nothing is happening.
Yeah. And to your point, there was also reporting after, Biden met with Eric Adams and all these police officers in New York about, actually, I'm just going to say he just met with them because I don't know if it was in New York. I'm pretty sure it was in New York, but I'm not totally sure. That there was all this reporting in the New York Times saying inside the rift between the White House and the police, and how Democrats are moving closer to the police after this meeting. And it's when were they there was never a rift. They were never misaligned with the police. This is all this is this myth that keeps being repeated and used to justify these things that people are trying to figure out. People are trying to explain why certain violent crimes did go up, and ascribing all of these causes to things where there's no correlation necessarily. And that the fact that that's continually repeated in mainstream media is extremely damaging to public opinion and to public policy in ways that I think are not really explored enough.
I think when you mentioned as well, the fact that the judge who convicted Derek Chauvin, how he was the one that approved this warrant, that really says so much. It really speaks to the way that, despite all the activism and despite all the energy and that people have put into trying to advocate for serious change, it seems the system is sort of incapable of addressing anything on a systemic level. And the Chauvin's trial was kind of given as an example of how there's this progress being made because individual bad actors are being punished. Meanwhile, all these systemic issues that allow people that allow the George Floyd killing to happen in the first place, or that still allow the Amir Locke killing to happen, are just never addressed, or in fact only fester and continue to get worse. But activists are supposed to be happy that this small, slight progress is made by individual bad actors in the system actually facing consequences for it.
And yeah, I mean, the other piece of that in the Locke case is this issue of how they're scrutinizing or not scrutinizing police requests for no-knock warrants. And Radley Balco has done a lot of reporting on this in Arkansas in particular, but there's this thing called boilerplate language that police will often say, you know, in my experience, when there are drugs, there are guns, you know, and that's sort of a justification that they'll put into a warrant request for a judge. And that is constitutionally barred for a lot of reasons, but the practice continues sort of unabated because it's really difficult to access those warrants, you know, in a timely manner for the public or for media to report on it. But it causes like the exponential sort of damage that comes from a simple thing like that is horrifying when you look at it. And I think, you know, the other important piece of this is that this whole conversation around no-knock warrants in Minneapolis was not even because of, you know, it was partially because of George Floyd, but George Floyd's situation didn't have anything to do with the no-knock warrant. But Breonna Taylor's killing happened because of a no-knock warrant. And so the power that had to, you know, influence all of these changes in other cities, that sort of still didn't address these underlying issues where, you know, there's so many people that you have to get in line on the same page to make changes to their day-to-day work, whether it's judges, you know, making sure that they're actually paying attention to what police are asking for in their warrants. And like, there are a lot of structural issues there too. Like, do we have the infrastructure to be able to apply this amount of scrutiny to like, that's a lot of man work that has to be done. And so I think there's a lot at play here that makes it really difficult for these things to be put in place, even when there are the best intentions and even when there is this massive popular uprising calling for it, which, you know, raises questions about, you know, how representative is our democracy? How responsive is our government to the people? And I think, you know, obviously we all think a certain way about that to a certain extent. But in this case, in this situation, like, you know, the confluence of racial justice and police brutality issues and, you know, widening socioeconomic inequality, like, you have to wonder sort of how long this tension can last. And sort of like, you know, we saw the most, you know, intense protests in recent history in 2020. And again, there were thousands of people in the streets in Minneapolis. And so, you know, I just wonder sort of what that's going to look like this year.
Yeah, that's the thing. The government not being representative of like the body politic is a huge. There's a stark contrast between kind of like the people with their hands on the levers of power and the people who are outraged by this. And I remember seeing a poll in 2020. So, you know, recency bias might have played into it a little bit, but it was in the summer of 2020 in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And 96% of people who were polled saying they wanted to see changes to the system so that, you know, bad or abusive officers were punished. That's like the bare minimum, right? But even still, a majority of respondents wanted to see reform. So like, that's not even like calling for defunding the police. Like, that's just saying a majority of people want to see the police in this country and how police operate in this country being reformed. That's like a moderate take. But the thing is, Democrats aren't even proposing that.
Yeah.
Like, what are they doing on that? They're not doing anything. Biden's going out and saying they need more funding. It's just like, it's total, like, just this snide, condescending animus toward voters. I don't get it.
Well, it's, I mean, and what you're saying too about being representative, it raises the question, whenever you have this kind of push and pull between elected officials and the police, is you start to wonder, like, who actually has the power in these governments? Like you mentioned, like Jacob Fry is talking about ending the use of these no-knock warrants, but while also admitting that, like, there's not actually anything I can really do, because if the cops say that there's danger, then they can just do it anyways. And it kind of, you start to wonder, like, what actual power elected officials actually do have to rein in these completely out of control police departments. I mean, and this is an international issue. It's like in Montreal, actually, the Montreal Police Department is one of the worst police departments in North America. You know, they're up there with any of the worst police departments in terms of corruption, in terms of violence. Our mayor, Val Plante, campaigned on reducing their funding, on kind of pushing back against the power that the police department has. And it's the same kind of thing. They end up just getting more funding, and none of the reforms that she promised have even been acted on. You also had all this stuff with Bill de Blasio in New York City when he was kind of feuding with the police department over his very mild criticisms of the NYPD and kind of openly opposed him and were openly defying him. Like, there's a really serious problem here where it just seems like these police departments have been so used to getting everything they want for decades and decades. It kind of seems like they have actually more power in our democracies than the actual elected officials do, which is not a great situation.
Yeah. And, there's plenty of examples of police departments or police unions suing to stop, popular sort of, whether it's a ballot measure or a policy change, in the wake of the 2020 protests. They sued in Louisville to stop that city from implementing a ban on no-knock warrants. And so there's that. And then there's also this sort of more esoteric power as far as like, when there is actually change put in place, when it, what do we do when it doesn't have its intended effect? And going back to sort of what's happening with respect to this in Congress, like the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that, was going to be passed, at the anniversary of his death, and Biden committed to passing it and blah, 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 blah. It had some significant changes in it, but it gave more money to the police, and Democrats couldn't even pass that. And so, and there's literally been no talk of another plan to resurrect that. After they embarrassed themselves kneeling in kente cloth, there hasn't been a peep about this year. It's all, it's completely gone from mind, and Biden is appearing with Eric Adams and, dozens of police officers. So that's sort of, if there was any sort of thought that Biden was going to deliver on this, I think like there was a little that the White House could have done anyway. And I just don't think that there's no pushing Congress when they can't even pass the Build Back Better plan.
Awesome.
And so a lot of this stuff, these conversations about police violence, which there's been zero improvement, there's been zero effort to actually, enact even these very mild reforms like you're mentioning. Meanwhile, you also have a crisis like within the criminal justice system, in the prison, the mass incarceration in the prison system as well. Mm-hmm. And you have just horror stories coming out from various prisons across the United States, from Rikers Island, a number of other examples, which I know we can get into. I know this is one thing that when the beginning of the pandemic, that's something that was one of the first things that occurred to us, like when we started talking about this, just the way that it's the likelihood that these prisons are going to become, COVID hotspots, and the people that live in these facilities, of which there are many millions, is the highest prison population on Earth right now. And a lot of the data that's coming in is indicating that is indeed happening, and these places are just becoming complete epicenters of disease and death and violence, and all these issues have not been addressed in any way. I know you have been covering a lot of the stuff that's been going on in the prison system throughout the last year or two. Do you want to just update us on some of what you've discovered in your reporting?
Yeah, so I've been sort of following, I was following a lot of efforts to release people and sort of cut jail populations at the beginning of COVID. And there was a lot of progress made in cutting prison and jail populations at the beginning of the pandemic, but most of them have, risen back to their pre-pandemic populations or above. And I've been following in Philadelphia, there's been litigation over jail conditions and prison conditions, all over the country. But in Philadelphia, the city agreed, they agreed to pay $150,000, I think, to a local bail fund this year, which was their second settlement in litigation over, actually litigation is not the right word. It's their second settlement in this lawsuit over conditions in the Philadelphia jail, where 19 people have died in Philly jails, in the last year or so, which I think is around, if not higher than the number of people that have died at Rikers. And I just mentioned that comparison, not because it's, one is more important than the other, but there has been way more coverage of the Rikers situation. And there's been some more attention to what's happening in Pennsylvania, but there was some reporting today that Pennsylvania hasn't been accurately reporting the number of deaths in its jails. So even the data that we do have doesn't really tell a full picture of like just how bad things have gotten in here. You know, this is sort of the similar complaints at a lot of places, but being locked in your cell for 23 hours a day, not having access to sanitary supplies or clean water. I covered a Legionnaire's outbreak in a New Jersey state prison a little under a year ago that they didn't tell the incarcerated population about. They found out basically through word of mouth, and it impacted a lot of people. And these are just, I think what's important, I want to just highlight the fact that like, while the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely, without a doubt, exacerbated and made conditions in jails and prisons really terrible, I think it's also just given people an outlet to bring attention to how bad conditions were prior to COVID and how we sort of just allow people to languish in cell blocks, where, their constitutional and human rights are supposed to still be protected, and they're absolutely not. And that we sort of just write that off because they're, condemned people and they're there, serving time for something. And so I think that's sort of one thing that I would just underscore just overall.
I'm looking here at a friend of the show, Adam Johnson, of the podcast Citations Needed. He has a Substack called The Column, put out a piece on January 28th because the data is coming in from 2020, which showed a 61% rise in U.S. prison deaths, which is just like, it's kind of unfathomable. And it's like, it's amazing the extent to which this has been kind of completely ignored. Like, you don't really hear about these stories. This is not being really told in the media. It's something that should be a huge scandal. Like you pointed out, and this isn't all because of COVID. I mean, these places were already like completely, there were people already languishing and suffering in these facilities already, but it's just been exacerbated by the whole pandemic. Like Adam points out as well, part of it is that the facilities are so tied up with dealing with COVID patients that other people that have other medical issues are being completely ignored. It's a really huge, like startling rise, and not something that's really being discussed. And in fact, I think the really interesting and fucked up framing is that when you talk about what the media has been talking about, and it's like we mentioned, they've been talking about the Democrats' plans to defund the police. They've been talking about, this crime wave, the shoplifting crime wave that we hear endless stories about. There's been just so many stories about, people are walking out of Walgreens without paying. You're getting all kinds of viral footage of like grandmas throwing themselves in front of these mean shoplifters that are stealing from Walmart and all these big corporations. And the fact that there's this like ongoing crisis of death and misery in the United States prison system, completely not ever mentioned.
Rob, I think you're being a bit blasé here. There is a serious shoplifting wave here. Just this week we saw 10 steaks being stolen from a Trader Joe's in New York. Wow. But thankfully, our nation's best and brightest in the media circles are all over it, and MSNBC had a panel with 5 pundits today talking about that story. A pundit for every 2 steaks, and it was just really remarkable to see that, because like this isn't. I mean, that's a one-off thing. That isn't like a steak like grand heist throughout. New York, they're not going from store to store and stealing all of these things. This is a one-off incident, and what they're trying to do is drum up that fear. This is also something that MSNBC like traditionally mocked when Fox was doing it, like a month or 2 ago. There's a clip I found today from MSNBC a month ago debunking the Republican hysteria over shoplifting, and now they're just like, all right, well, if you can't beat them, join them. So now they're doing it, and what's really sad is like, Trader Joe's has like been under fire, and I think even had to pay like a pretty big fine or settlement for wage theft. I mean, where's your coverage of that? Is that part of the conversation? Why don't we talk about things like that? No, it's the individual 10 steak thing, because that feeds into a larger narrative about funding the police.
And I just had to find this because I remember seeing this, and like, this is when I was like, I'm not reading about this anymore. This, there was some reporting about, alleged shocking doubling rates of shoplifting in Target in San Francisco. And it was literally an error in the system, that the automated system that they used to report. And it was just repeated, uncritically, numerous times, in various media outlets, until somebody went and sort of looked at what was going on. And like, you just think about how often that happens when we're extrapolating, a 5-person panel on CNN from one incident, and what that does to, I mean, it's just like, can I curse? I was just gonna say it's fucked up. Like, you can't just like scare people into like, into believing, everything that they're reading about this stuff. And unfortunately, that's what's happening. And like, it takes a lot more work to go back and explain to people like why, that shocking headline that they saw was wrong, than it does to actually, to do it right in the first place. So it's just really frustrating as a reporter.
Yeah,
certainly.
I imagine so. And it's also really, I think, worthwhile to take a look at the discrepancy. Talking about, the coverage, for instance, of the NYPD officer that was killed a few weeks ago, and the massive kind of state funeral that he got with hundreds of thousands of cops on the streets of New York, and the wall-to-wall coverage of that in the media. And, when you talk about the statistically, the likelihood that police officers are going to be killed on the job versus like this epidemic of violence of people being gunned down in the street in their own homes, which, as you pointed out, is only increasing, this epidemic of violence and misery in the United States prison system. Like, there's zero comparison. But she's like what the actual priority is of the media to sort of sharing this message. And like, if you ask probably average people that take their cues from the media, they'll tell you that it's like, police are just being defunded. They're being defunded and abandoned by liberal politicians. They're just being shot at day in, day out and killed on the job. And the constant violence that people are suffering at the hands of the police, both in the street and in the prison system, completely just off everyone's radar. It's incredibly dystopian when you break down this kind of discrepancy.
Yeah, I noticed there was some reporting on the funeral of one of the officers that was killed. Well, one thing I wanted to mention is that during that, there was footage of all these cops like jumping over the turnstiles in the subway system in New York.
Yeah, with no masks.
Yeah, which is the site has the subway turnstile is the site of many an arrest and harassment by NYPD all the time. So that is just ironic and whatever, annoying. But at the funeral of one of the officers, his widow basically said, I know that you hated all of these, this progressive district attorney's policies, and, we're all thinking about that, now that you're gone, and like they're hearing you speak through me, basically like directing her comments at the DA. And so just that example to say that, all of this reporting on this so-called, crime wave, the shoplifting spree, all of that stuff, violence against police, is being blamed on criminal justice reform efforts, like even at a very local level. And that is like, that's what's driving sort of these recall efforts against Chesa Boudin and Larry Krasner. And there's a couple district attorneys in Northern Virginia where, right-wing operatives are spending, not insignificant amounts of money. This is separate, but the Newsom recall election, I think they wasted like $200 million. And that is like, the Newsom recall is like I don't even know what's going on there. I think some of these things overlap, but it's more about the pandemic. But just the district attorney recalls, this reminds me of like this crazy thing in California that we reported on last year, where this like this angel investor basically ran a GoFundMe to raise money to get a reporter to like uncover how terrible Chesa Boudin had been for San Francisco. And he is like considering running for mayor. And so there's just like crazy amounts of money being thrown into this also to sort of hype up this false narrative that not only are all these things, not only is everything getting worse in terms of crime, but it's because of these, progressive reform ideas that are taking hold.
I think what's really frustrating, well, of the many things that are frustrating about all of this, and to go back to the prison population thing, is just as we see people, who, not all of them are in there on life sentences, and not all of them committed like heinous crimes. And not that even if someone did, that doesn't mean they deserve to die, especially a premature death, or die from COVID, or die from mistreatment, or whatever. But just the total like ignorance to their suffering from a vast majority of people is really frustrating.
I mean, there's people in Rikers that haven't even been convicted of a crime. Like,
yeah, it's just like it's really disgusting. And if they even are lucky enough to get out later, companies basically in many places in the country can just like totally, quietly discriminate against them, refuse to hire them, demand a background check, and, not explicitly acknowledge that's why they're not hiring them. But it's like, it's much harder for someone to re-enter society. And this entire system hinges on that concept that you go in, you pay your dues, you come out better off for it. But because our system is so stacked against them, that's why we have such high recidivism rates. And then even though people might want to turn their life around, they understand the severity of what they did, that people will turn a blind eye to them being mistreated, abused, or dying in jail or prison. It just completely upends this entire premise, which only works if we're all bought in on it. So it's just it's reflective of a real callousness in society that I just like really can't get over.
I mean, yeah, most people in jail are, pre-trial or haven't been convicted. And I think like, to a certain extent, I think a lot of people do know that, but I think people don't really fully understand what that means in terms of like how just the basic idea that our Constitution applies to everyone, which, obviously we've talked about many examples where that's not the case, but that, the widespread impact that has on a daily basis, and like the fact that the number continues to increase, isn't alarming to more people. I think, Jordan, your word callous, describes it pretty perfectly. And the other thing is that while there had been sort of all these efforts to sort of pay more attention to these issues and take a more sort of humane approach to criminal justice that would then reduce recidivism rates, we're seeing that then now blamed for, when there was an incident where, was it Kenosha, when there was the person drove into the, into the parade? It was like widely reported that it was, it was because he was let out on bail because of this progressive prosecutor. And like, that wasn't the case at all. Like, and so that is it's just frustrating that in turn sort of works against any efforts to address conditions, for people who are incarcerated and in a lot of cases haven't been convicted of a crime or even gone to trial. And the times for the wait times for that has only gotten worse with court closures during the pandemic. And so, just the idea that so many people, are languishing for in particular for, without having gone through that process is really disturbing, when you think about how widespread it is.
Yeah, and I guess the really grim reality right now is like, I think everyone seems to understand that electorally, the electoral prospects for the Democratic Party is not exactly looking too great right now, what with the failure to pass the entire agenda that they campaigned on, which I'm sure they'll also end up blaming on activists in the first place. But now it looks like even the very, very mild, modest reforms that were maybe possible with the Democratic Party are not even going to be an option anymore, which is like a really grim, I think, prospect for the future of this kind of movement in America. And like I saw that there were protests forming in response to the Amir Locke killing. I'm kind of wondering what the prospects are of that possibly spiraling into something similar to what we saw in 2020. At the same time, I imagine for activists, it's got to be really exhausting to know the amount of energy and time and blood and sweat and tears that activists poured into that movement in 2020, to see the results be so contrary to everything that they was asked for, to see them going backwards in many ways. I imagine it's going to be really difficult for people to sort of convince themselves to keep going out there and keep putting their bodies on the line when it looks like none of these mass mobilizations, no matter how big they are actually having any kind of impact in terms of the criminal justice system in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it's really depressing when you put it that way. But I think
I have a knack for that. Yeah, I've been told. Yeah.
But I think, while I certainly think there hasn't been a lot to suggest that, even if these changes do go into place, that they're going to have sort of the intended impact in the amount of time that would be sort of like appropriate to actually change the system. But I think that at the same time, there is no world in which something like what the protests in 2020 were calling for isn't met with this much opposition. I just think that is the nature of how these systems are designed to work. And so I think while it doesn't, I have no idea what things are going to look like. I think the conversation has certainly progressed to a place, whether it's fundamentally good or bad or positive or negative, the conversation has certainly, I think, made progress. Even if we have these dumb conversations about whether or not Democrats should be defunding the police when they're not even defunding the police, the idea that, there was, there were at least, a majority of members of the Democratic caucus that were gonna, push for a federal ban on no-knock warrants, even if that is symbolic and no-knock warrants continue to happen. I think a lot of activists understand that and sort of do the work that they do because they don't think that operating within the system will fundamentally change things. But you still need people in positions of power to at least start having the conversation, whether they're genuine about it or not. So I think that is one positive takeaway. And I think just remembering that, revolutionary sort of change, like the types of things that people who were protesting in 2020 want to see happen to the carceral system and the police system. It's never going to look like what people expect it to look like. But that doesn't mean that it's not it's useless necessarily. So I think, I don't necessarily feel good about anything significant changing in Minneapolis, particularly after what Jacob Frey said about his power to actually put a stop to this. But I do think that the fact that he was sitting in a city council meeting where people were making him, he had to admit that he used language that was, too, quote, casual to describe this warrant, or this purported ban that he had put in place. And so while that isn't a substantive thing that will make change in Minneapolis, I don't necessarily think that that's something that might have happened, if we were talking about this 20 years ago, which seems sort of like, I feel even silly for framing it that way, but I think, when you're faced with so much destruction and sort of horrifying news, and you want to feel like, or it's very easy to feel like there's no point to any of this. And I think maybe the point is not, necessarily what we think it is. Whether that's passing a law or something, people didn't even though the George Floyd bill was the quote unquote best chance for Dems to do something on criminal justice reform, people who are out in the streets marching don't give a shit about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Yeah. They just want to feel safe in their communities. And so I think getting people to even have these conversations is something of an achievement in that sense.
Yeah, and if push came to shove and people did try to push Dems on it, especially right now where it looks like nothing is going to happen before midterms at all.
Yeah.
They would just kind of, pass the buck and be like, well, that's a local issue. You should go fight and organize at the local level. But the Dems have no real grassroots strategy. They just have been getting their clocks cleaned in state legislatures and at the local level for decades. So it's already a totally lopsided system. You save for some of the bigger cities, and even there, you have some pretty conservative dealings in completely blue areas. So it's just there's no real robust, committed, progressive grassroots effort the Dems even back that could even tackle this at the local level.
No. No, definitely not. And I think it's going to be interesting because if Democrats lose, people who were out protesting or who voted for Biden because they thought that they were actually going to do something on criminal justice reform, which, I don't know for how many people that's like a single issue for how many voters, but I know that a lot of people really do care about that. And that is going to be somehow spun as, not a failure of Dems not passing Biden's social spending package or doing anything to materially make, living conditions better for working class people as he promised, or doing anything for Black voters, as he also promised. That somehow that's not going to be seen as a failure on Democrats. It's going to be seen as, voters not knowing what's good for them or something like that. So,
Well, it sounds like you want the Republicans to get voted in. Jeez, that's going to be
me.
Yeah, that's going to be every single time. That's how.
There was some reporting on this in 2020, but I think this is also going to be interesting to watch. But there was despite Republican rhetoric on a lot of this stuff, there was a shift among minority voters to the Republican Party and away from Democrats, and I think there hasn't been like a good faith effort to sort of talk about why that was. And I'm not saying I necessarily think that's going to happen again. But I do think that, it could be something that's more like people just don't show up. And I could see that being a real thing, especially with the voting rights stuff, because that was another promise. And now we have this Supreme Court decision that basically said that, go fuck yourselves. We're going to gerrymander you if you like it or not.
Yeah. Well, Manchin said no, so not much you can do about it.
Yeah.
You certainly can't mention his name or go put any pressure on him, because that would be way over the line, obviously, from what we're taking from what they've been doing so far.
Uncivil.
Yeah, it'd be very uncivil to actually say something to the people in your own party that are blocking your own agenda from passing. But yeah, I think that's the kind of the scary thing too. And you look back throughout American history and you see these these moments of progress that get met with this kind of big reactionary backlash, like the civil rights movement and the civil rights legislation that passed in the late 60s, which people really struggled for. It resulted in a number of positive progressive changes. And then there's this big reactionary backlash after of the mass incarceration era and the Reagan era and all this stuff. And now this kind of scary thing about what's happening in America right now is you feel that reactionary backlash coming, and there hasn't actually been really any progress to speak of to even lead to it. Now you have, like I said, they've been giving more money to the police. They haven't passed any of these criminal justice reforms. And now you have a move on the part of Republicans to ban the teaching of any form of racism in American history, and to sort of so this whole reactionary backlash is coming, and there hasn't been any real significant progress to speak of to actually counterbalance that, which is a kind of a scary moment in American history.
Yeah, and instead of talking about how I'm just thinking about Glenn Youngkin, because the school that I went to, apparently he's speaking at this ceremony that they're having, and I was just appalled when someone told me that today. But his win in Virginia was sort of, all people talked about was oh, well, he was really good on the pandemic and on school closures and understanding what people wanted, and not that he just completely bought into this fear mongering on critical race theory and energized people in the reddest parts of the state. I think both of those things certainly had something to do with the election, but I think to pretend, which a lot of, pundits and analysts have, that the critical race theory stuff is not as significant, or, concerning is just disingenuous. And yeah, the number of bills that states have passed banning critical, under the guise of banning critical race theory, but that have actually passed laws restricting First Amendment rights and freedom of speech and striking fear into the hearts of teachers and students and their families, should really alarm Republicans. And, they're having a field day. So yeah. That's also something that's really frustrating. And unfortunately, just the world that we live in, there was a ton of reporting on the critical race theory hysteria and very little on what lawmakers were actually doing to codify, policies and laws around, basically cementing this boogeyman into our sort of psyche, and now we've moved on to back to the crime wave, and I don't know that we're going to get a thorough investigation of that. So it sucks.
Great. Well, it happened again. It happened again. Maybe we're going to leave the gaming talk to the end of the show, and then we can leave on something more lighthearted next time.
But I think there's a bright spot. We're going to have I think distraction, and people can, move on. A good thing that I think everyone is going to agree is a good idea, and it certainly won't be argued in bad faith by Republicans. I think a nominal amount of money to support safe using sites.
Yes.
There's no way that could blow up. There's no way they could take that and just say Biden's giving people crack pipes.
Yeah, that would just be way too disingenuous.
There's no way that
don't do this to me.
I saw that this morning. I didn't know the background, and I just saw Biden's giving people crack pipes, and I'm like,
somehow
what is this?
Yeah.
What is this? But it's like I think $30 million to support potentially $30 million to support safe using sites, and within with safe using sites, if it's for heroin, hey, here's a clean needle so you don't spread disease or get contracted disease if you're using used needles or sharing or whatever. And I think within this there's pipes that people could use. I don't care about that. I understand, as someone who wrestled with addiction when he was younger, lost friends to addiction. That is the lowest possible bar a government can do. And also when I was in all over Europe in December, I saw these everywhere.
Yeah.
I saw say needle drops in the park everywhere. Yeah. It's people just fucking get it. It's look, this is a problem. Obviously the war on drugs isn't going to get rid of it. How do we make it a little bit more manageable? Oh, here's a place where you can dump your needles. Hey, here's a clean needle so you don't contract HIV. It very, very base level stuff that a normal civilized society would mutually agree upon.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to everything that we've been saying. It's it seems like, especially in the United States, is the only way that people can imagine that these social problems are dealt with, whether it's drug abuse, whether it's homelessness, is through this punitive carceral system, and anything that tries to inject any kind of empathy into that or deal with things in a less punitive way without relying on law enforcement, without relying on the carceral system, is just demonized and immediately given up on. And the only way that these social issues can ever be tackled is by just more money to the cops, more militarization, more prisons. And it just shows no sign of slowing down. And in fact, judging from what is on the horizon politically, will probably only continue to speed up and escalate.
Yeah, when a friend texted me the crack pipe thing, and I was just I don't know what to say. I assume that this has something to do with safe injection sites. But I just think it's fascinating also to think about how the response to something like this is in comparison to the response to the opioid epidemic more broadly, in terms of the pharmaceutical companies that were responsible for it, and sort of compassion for the hundreds of thousands of families that have lost people to the opioid epidemic. And to contrast that to, okay, yeah, but when we're talking about making it safer for people, who use other drugs, it's a moral catastrophe. And I do think, I think it's interesting. It's not surprising to me that the conservative sites sort of they seized on the fact that it said safe smoking kits in this in this grant that is supposed to be going to these programs. Republicans have sort of tried to carve out a lane for themselves on, or at least under Trump, they had tried to carve out a lane for themselves on being there being sort of room for bipartisan movement on criminal justice and prison reform and marijuana legalization or stuff like that. And I think that's totally just gone out the window sort of in the last couple of of years in a way, even though they were never, genuinely committed to it at all. But I just think it's interesting that sort of the messaging has shifted a lot to sort of be much more punitive, especially when we're talking about people of another race or another class who might be using, this type of drug, and sort of the narratives that get ascribed to that and how media seizes on it. But, I realized that when I was Googling this and it was like Newsweek and Fox and all these things, I was like, okay, so this is how this one's going to go.
Yeah. And of course they just immediately back down as well, rather than even make any effort whatsoever to explain like what this stuff is. It's just like, oh no, that's out, Jack.
Yeah.
This is the first response.
Never mind. Yeah.
Forget we said anything.
Yeah.
Don't get too mad at us. Yeah, good stuff. Very inspiring.
I'll just also mention the Justice Department is also like they're evaluating whether to support this Supreme Court case on safe injection sites right now, which was something that the Trump administration had opposed, and Biden hadn't weighed in yet, and a lot of people were wondering sort of when he took office whether they were going to take a position on that. So that cocould be a positive thing if they would weigh in support of upholding the site's right to exist. So that is a positive note to end on.
Unless you want to examine the political makeup of the Supreme Court when it starts to get less possible. You wonder whether that's going to be possible.
You're not leaving here in a good mood.
Yeah,
that's our commitment.
I refuse to let it happen. I refuse.
Oh my God. I just read this crazy story. Have you guys read the story about Clarence Thomas's wife?
Well, I know a lot about her, but is there something new?
There was Jane Mayer wrote this profile in the New Yorker, I think it was last month, that we were just discussing. And it goes into it's unbelievable how many conflicts of interest she has with cases that, by far-right groups that have business before the court. And it just sort of goes into all of that and like how other justices have handled even the appearance of a conflict of interest, and how there's sort of like no mechanism for holding her or Clarence Thomas accountable with respect to this. And it's wild. I highly recommend it. Yeah.
And like, so I remember I listened to an NPR interview with her about it. I didn't read it. But one of the things I remember she mentioned was Roberts' wife quit her job when he got confirmed, because they didn't want like any conflict of interest at all. And like other justices will recuse themselves if they have a spouse that's involved in any case. She's passed away now, but Ginsburg, when her husband Marty, who was a pretty prominent litigator, I think he gave up his practice too. Like, there's a long history of people going out of their way to recuse themselves from cases to avoid conflicts of interest. And like, not only is she like, are they not doing that, but like, she's connected with some pretty fringe fucking people on the right too.
Yeah, like Frank Gaffney.
Yeah, Ollie Alexander, I think there's even some like an overlap with a lot of the January 6th people.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, it's really, really grotesque.
Yeah. It's scary. And like, I don't know. It's also, this is another thing where it's like, Democrats, are they going to do the civility politics thing and like not do everything they possibly can to add someone? And if history repeats itself, which it does, I think the answer is no. And so, that sets up a really dark future for all of us.
Awesome. Now that's what we're looking for.
You're really getting
that's what we're going for.
That's
Thank
what we
you.
need.
Now,
That's the good stuff.
We've got enough now, right?
Yeah, I think we got it all. I think we covered it all. Yeah. You have to laugh sometimes.
Perfect.
You just have to laugh.
Perfect.
It's the only thing you can do. Well, Akela, it's I'm not going to say it was a pleasure to talk to you. It was kind of painful at times, but not your fault at all. We really appreciate that you were able to come on. We really appreciate the work that you do and the reporting you do with the Intercept. Just want to let everyone know where they can find you online and find your writing. And before we say goodbye here.
Yeah, at Akela_Lacy, AKELACY, and at theintercept.com. Thank you guys for having me. It was fun, even though it was also
that's
sad,
how we do it.
But it's nice to talk to people about it.
Yep. Well, thanks again. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you guys.
Care. Thank you for listening to The Insurgents. Please remember to subscribe over at theinsurgents.substack.com. Find the podcast on all your favorite podcast apps, and please remember to leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It's very helpful and we appreciate it a lot. But please, again, don't mention Ken Klippenstein in the review. He is banned from the show. It's a lifetime ban, so please do not mention him in the review. And we'll be back later this week with more of the content that you know and love. Goodbye.